Hello and welcome to this lovely Ask Me Anything session with Michael Andrews. My name is Joaquin Malara, and I'm the founder of Swarm, as well as the host of the AI Digest. Michael, it's a great pleasure to have another chance to speak with you.
Well, thank you, Joaquin. I'm very happy to be back. We had a great discussion before, and looking forward to continuing that discussion with you today.
And I said it before we started recording. I'll say it now again. You look really snazzy. Uh,
Yeah, I'm wearing a fancy fleece thing. That's all it is sort of a hoodie without the hood. But
so today we're going to be talking about who you are and a little bit about what your thoughts are in the latest developments with generative AI and RAG. But let's just dive a little bit into your background and some of the things that you've done to give the audience context. You are a metadata expert. You've written two books on the matter, and you are focused on helping enterprises transform how they develop and manage content. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and sort of the work that you've done to date?
yeah, absolutely. So my specialty is what I call content architecture, which is thinking about how content is put together. And when you think about how content is put together, we have to think about how you break it down and into discrete pieces that have different meanings and roles to them. So this is something I've been focused on for much of my career, especially over the past 10 years. I've worked for um, as a consultant. I've worked for startups who work in this area, looking at how to structure content so you can do things with it, and even how you can be folding in AI in that. And one of the areas that I have a lot of expertise in particular, is content metadata. So, I mean, there's a lot of metadata out there that's more focused on managing just sort of things like transactional data or uh, things of that nature. But I focus specifically on the metadata for content. And this is an area that actually can support the use of AI a lot. So it's an area that I am looking at a lot in terms of, what are the opportunities, what are the obstacles, um, and specifically in this, area of generative AI, which of course is getting so much attention. We have a lot of people exploring it right now, and as we've moved into 2024, we find that people are starting to get into the sort of the nitty gritty of like, how do you really make this work effectively? I mean, we kind of have moved beyond that sort of initial uh, phase of just being sort of intrigued by it and kind of wowed by some of the things it can do. But now we're really looking at the use cases and where is this really practical, and what would it take to make it practical for a use case. And so those are the sorts of things that I've been following very closely, and paying attention to examples I think have some potential, also noting some things that aren't really moving as quickly as we might have thought a year ago. So that's what I'm focusing on right now.
Okay, I'm gonna ask a silly question. I'm gonna say take a step back and ask a silly question. When I think about content, I
Yeah,
think about books, I think
yeah.
about magazines, I think about videos.
Mm.
Are you orchestrating the development and publishing of these sort of materials? Can you educate the audience as to what content is and how it applies to engineers?
Right. Absolutely. So um, when I talk about content, I'm talking specifically about digital content that would be delivered online. So a book, you can make it digital, absolutely. Movies are different, delivered digitally. Magazines are as well, but is much broader than that. And so your examples here are really of what are often long form content. A book will have hundreds of pages. A movie could last a couple hours. A magazine is a pretty big uh, piece of content. But those examples, though, are made up of smaller pieces. And that's really the point is once you start to modularize the content, yeah, you can combine it into a much larger long form kind of piece of content, but also the kind of content that we consume online, which are things like articles or very short videos that we will experience in different platforms, or content that appears in the context of apps, for example. So where that content is delivered, how it's rendered, those are all variables that really um, are associated with how that content was developed to begin with, and what sort of metadata is associated with it. So, just to give you a simple example, yeah, you find with people who talk about content now, they more and more talk about something called a supply chain for content. So, and you think about all the things that need to go into, say, a video. You need to write a script for that. You need to think about um, if you're shooting live video, how that's going to be shot. You need to, think about the segmentation of the video. Then you have, various kinds of post production for that video. It's all bits and pieces that then get, composed together, comped together into an output that we'll see, and that output then has a certain format to it, has a certain length to it, has various qualities that we will tag with metadata. But the precursors of that, all the inputs into that video, are also things that we can tag and track, and then potentially reuse pieces of that. So if we want to localize that video, for example, we can maybe just take out some of the soundtrack, the voiceover there, and use a different voiceover for a different locale. Maybe we need to change the in any sort of overlays on the video. So that's the kind of thing in the case of a video that you can do when you start to modularize all this content. Now, it's interesting that video is an area that we're now starting to see more interest in generative AI working with, and it's interesting, but you're still kind of generally getting just sort of a talking avatar head there, sort of yap 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 yap. Here I am reading a transcript to you, but when we think about what could be there, we could orchestrate a much richer video experience, having more uh, modularity into the inputs, and tagging that with metadata. So, it's just one example of the kinds of things that you can do when you have the modularity and the tagging.
One more silly question, and then I'll let you run with the thoughts that you shared with me earlier in the conversation. Um, Metadata,
Mm,
data about data,
right.
pretty meta.
Yeah.
So, what is that? Why is it useful? Maybe in the context of a music store or a bookstore. Why should we care about metadata?
Yeah, so it really allows us to track things, to find things, to manage things, to uh, maintain them, and to deliver them where they're needed. So, just take an example of music. We all um, listen to streaming music, and that music has a lot of metadata associated with it. And so obviously there's an artist, there's a song title, there's the very obvious things, but then there are things about the rights to that, and there's rights and royalties associated with the streaming of the music, and so people need to be able to track where that content's been delivered, and how often it's been played, and things like that. So the metadata is it allows you to get insights into what's there, allows you to manage it, allows you to often monetize things, and it really gives you a lot of control that we didn't have in the analog era. If we kind of think back to those days, as I know it's a long time ago, but um, we get a lot more out of that. And so, I think with the rise of generative AI, um, there are a lot of interesting metadata issues that are coming into play there. Like, who created it? How do we account for describing who's created that? Uh, what is the provenance of it? Is it something that is being is it reworked from something that have was existed previously? And if it did, whose work was that? Um, and these have big implications for rights and for copyright and things like that. And I think one of the big trends we're starting to see being discussed this year with generative AI is about intellectual property, and people are starting to look at that issue a lot more closely. And we're seeing pushback from certain publishers, like the New York Times, for example, suing um, uh, OpenAI, and I mean, they're not alone, and a lot of publishers are pushing back on the idea that their content can be just crawled, and then that raw material could be repurposed by someone else and be monetized by someone else. So I think as these issues become more and more debated and litigated and regulated, uh, the role of metadata is going to be more important, because we'll get more granular about what was out there, where it came from, uh, and what permissions were associated with that, which would influence what someone else might be able to do with it. And we find now they are starting to develop some metadata standards around the generative AI content, indicating some things about the provenance. Some of the tools, for example, are actually embedding some of this metadata in their outputs to indicate where it's come from. And then once those embedded pieces of metadata are there, other platforms that might be delivering that to people can expose it, and let people know that, okay, this video you've seen here is synthetically produced, for example. And that's going to be important for people, because they want to know, is this something real I'm seeing, or was it just made up?
I had yeah, just to provide some thoughts on what you've said to so far. I had a interview with Margaret Warren,
Oh,
and
yes. Yeah.
Margaret Warren specializes in imagery, uh,
Yes.
and metadata for imagery, and making it semantically interfaceable between people and machines.
Mhm.
And we covered some of those aspects in that interview as well. But you bring up a lot of good points. I mean, before it was pretty straightforward. You had a reporter go in, take pictures. What's the scoop? Say, tell me what's going on.
Right.
There was somebody who was collecting information from person to person in events before the digital era took place and streaming was available, and we're capable of doing things like these. But everything was created with people involved, and as that continued to evolve, there came a need to enforce greater greater layers of information for additional channels of distribution. I mean, before it was like photographer, writer, sent to newspaper, newspaper publish within the geographical area. It wasn't as complex as it is now that a publisher from India, a publisher from Japan can sell the rights of their content to the New York Times, and the New York Times will distribute that globally or in respective markets according to what that right allows them to do. I mean, the complexity of things has dramatically increased, but we haven't. I don't think that we've kept up with the times of educating our own editorial teams, our own content production teams, and how to navigate those times. Maybe I'm not aware of that because I'm not in that industry, but um, to further complicate matters, yeah, now we have not just synthetic, not just human made assets, images, audio, video, copywriting. Now we have synthetically generated.
You're
Where
right.
does it come from? Provenance. Where does it come from? Who
Yeah.
touched it? Where is it derived from? Do
Mhm.
the machines have the same kinds of rights that humans do? If a human interprets a creative work, that's a derivative, and there's some sort of interpretation and technical ability to translate that. But if a machine can pump out 10,000 Van Gogh paintings, just take landscape images from Pexels or whatever non-proprietary image repository and translate them all into Van Gogh paintings, is that ethical? Is that like something to sell? I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. Those are all really interesting questions, and I'm not going to um, particularly weigh on the ethics of them because there's so many nuances to that I wouldn't do it justice to try to do that. But yeah, it is something though that we will be seeing a lot more discussion of, and it relates to even a broader issue. Really, is how reliable is something that's synthetically produced is, and I think this is kind of the big question now that we're grappling with. I mean, we all know last year when generative AI kind of appeared on the scene in a big way, and we all suddenly got exposure to it. Uh, it was interesting. We were kind of surprised at how capable it seemed in some areas, and then how just wrongheaded it seemed in other areas. And um, I think the expectation was for people who really started digging into it deeply is like, okay, we can fix these problems with the accuracy. That's something we can overcome. And I think that's really where we've seen the majority of efforts going over the past year. I mean, a lot of companies are spending a lot of money trying to improve the accuracy of generative AI outputs. And they've largely been doing this using um, extensions to the framework of generative AI itself. So, you have lots of elaborate prompt engineering techniques that have emerged. We have ways of working with the context window. We have ways of trying to fine tune models, maybe develop specialized models. These are all basically the same techniques that we started with, but doing a lot more refinement of them. And indeed, we've found that you can improve the reliability of the outputs, but um, we're still faced with some of these core problems with generative AI. That um, they don't understand domains very well. That's one of the biggest barriers that they have. They don't seem to understand instructions well. If you give them, an elaborate set of instructions, they can get lost with that. They don't understand sort of that step 7 related to step 2. They tend to go through things kind of sequentially often. And they don't have the ability to do any kind of reasoning, and they don't have sort of this common sense knowledge of like, oh, well, that wouldn't make sense to do that, right? I mean, you and I as humans, we can go, well, that would just be, silly to want to do something like that. But the generative AI as an approach doesn't have that sort of built in. So people are constantly trying to work around these things, and so they throw more and more sort of the generative AI approaches um, at fixing the generative AI limitations. And I think we're kind of reaching a little bit of the limits of what we can do, at least in the near term, by doing that. So we see people are doing some great work now trying to benchmark different generative AI uh, models and applications to see how reliable they are. And that's all really good. And you can find they're inching up in the reliability of it. But really, when you start looking at non-trivial applications, which is what we ultimately are interested in here, they're just not there yet in terms of the reliability. So we have seen over the past year, one of the big ways that they're trying to compensate for this reliability issue is something called retrieval-augmented generation, RAG. And I think you had mentioned that just at the outset, didn't you? And this is a way really of sort of taking your generation aspect and connecting it with some kind of database query. So the presumption is if you have a database, a defined database that relates to a specific domain, you can, as part of your prompt, ask the chain of generative AI connected to a database to look something up and then give that back to the generative AI to include that in what they are producing. So it's a very sensible approach. And people are using this and finding that, yes, indeed, it is increasing the reliability of the generative AI. But, and this is the big but, is that this is not necessarily still getting us to the level we need to be. We have a need with non-trivial questions to have a high degree of reliability because the presumption has been with people using generative AI is that we're using it as a chatbot. And a chatbot implies that I, as a user, can ask a question and in one go pretty much get a reliable answer to that question. So if I have a question about an insurance policy, for example, I need to get a very clear, unambiguous, reliable answer to my question. And that's not there. We don't have that yet. So really, I think we have two things that we have to think about in the coming year about how we improve the reliability of AI, generative AI. One is maybe moving beyond the standard RAG approach. And the way a RAG approach works is that, think about it this way. We were talking earlier about long form content, like big documents. I mean, this is still something that the business world lives in. They create big documents of different kinds. Now, generative AI has a very small context window. It can't really absorb a lot of stuff to evaluate. So what they've done with RAG is take a big document and split it up, just arbitrarily kind of split it up into different size segments, small size segments that can fit in the context window. And then they index these and they come up with what's called a vector index that really kind of encodes what that segment of the split up document is about. And then the RAG query will look for a relevant segment and then find it and feed that in. So it's done okay, but there's still a lot of problems. The segments, when you break them up that way, they start losing the context, and people are finding that this is not working as well as they would like it to. So what I think is going to happen beyond RAG is that we'll start to incorporate a different kind of database rather than the vector uh, approach. And that will probably be a database that's based on what are called knowledge graphs. And knowledge graphs are another kind of database that are based on semantics, defining the semantics between different entities. So you had mentioned Margaret earlier. I mean, she uses knowledge graphs to define images that that she catalogs in her application, for example. So we can take an image and we can say, okay, this relates to this person, and that person here is connected with someone else, and maybe they have a common connection through an employer, and you're starting to map out all those relationships through a semantically defined graph. This really can allow you then to have a layer of a knowledge graph between the source content that has all kinds of really useful but complicated information in it, and be able to tie that back to the question that someone's asking of the generated AI. And I think it's a really exciting way because I mean, I think it's more sophisticated than using this vector indexing. And it really lets you get the full value out of the original content. And so just bringing this back to my passions here, I mean, that's where I don't think that we gain much by trying to pretend the original content is no longer valid. So we've, often are just looking at these AI issues like, oh, we can just extract whatever we need from that original content and just, don't have to worry about the original content anymore. Well, the way content works is because human language is so complex and nuanced, we need to be able to reference back that original content. I think having knowledge graphs as part of this equation allows us to do that.
Yeah, I'd like to just touch upon what you've said so far and kind of encapsulate it, and then we can open the room up for discussion if there's anyone that has any questions. But to start, you mentioned generative AI, and that includes large language models, any kind of model that's kind of encapsulating a kind of data, a kind of thing.
Yeah,
Uh,
sure. There are large image models as well, and yeah, there are other kinds of outputs that can be generated from large models. But yeah, definitely the language models are the ones that are getting most of the attention, I think. Yeah.
but these models, they are sort of like a crowdsource of ideas, a crowdsource of a type of thing. So large language models, it's basically they take the internet, they scrape forums and websites that have a lot of natural language, like a Reddit or whatever kind of large used public facing forum website. They scrape the way that language works at an atomic level, and they get just ideas from all these different kinds of concepts, domains, conversations. It doesn't matter. It doesn't need to have a particular area of knowledge. What it needs to do is it needs to understand mechanically how that area um, statistically works.
Mm,
More or less, what would a real person say under the scenario of asking a question around this thing?
yeah.
That's how generative AI works, whether it's for images, language, audio. I've seen a lot of people change, like Frank Sinatra sings "Gangsta's Paradise," things like that, or modifying the idea of one thing but interpret it in a different way. That's
Mhm.
what they're good for. Then you said that is inaccurate, because as I said, it's statistics. It's what would be a likely scenario that this happens. I'm not a creative individual. I can't assess a multitude of scenarios, but I can just spit out what I've been trained on as a model. Um, you said RAG is a means to enhance and enrich the way to work with generative AI, retrieval augmented generation. So having a repository of structured knowledge, structured data, something that we can retrieve to give some sort of fact based response or context, it sounds important. It sounds important because for anything non trivial, like, hey, virtual assistant, when is my flight? Oh, your flight is on Tuesday of next week. Okay, that better be accurate because
Right.
when I go to the airport, I don't want to miss my flight. Those are things that require a level of accuracy. If I go to if I go to my doctor or I go to my virtual doctor, virtual therapist,
Hmm.
they give me just like statistical nonsense that is not relevant to my unique case. If it's lacking context and accuracy, it's going to prescribe me something that's going to make me die. It's going to give me a adverse reaction to my body, or they might recommend, oh, you're depressed, like go isolate. Maybe that'll help. Maybe go and meditate.
Yeah.
Yeah, that might not help.
Right.
Um, so it's important to have context. And then you mentioned knowledge graphs. Knowledge graphs is a way to crystallize domain specific knowledge in a graph format, and to do some sort of hybrid approach between a model and a knowledge graph, which has crystallized facts and relationships and a rich understanding of a domain. That to me seems like the winner combination. Um,
Yeah, I think it is. And, because I mean, generative AI is very good. I mean, these large models are very good for more general things. I mean, if that's what you need, if you just need sort of some more generalized response, they're fine, and we want to take advantage of those capabilities. I mean, there have been some efforts to develop more specialized generative models. I think there's, for example, an LLM that's specific to the finance industry, because there's a lot of kind of jargon that's used in the finance industry, for example. So, you know, you can at least understand the lingo of the finance industry from that model. How investment analysts talk about things, and the ratios that they talk about and things of that nature. But it's not going to give you the the concrete data and information from that model. Uh, so, and similarly, like with images. So, as you said, right now, so many of these image models are just based on scraping the web. And, there's a lot of images on the web, but there's a lot of specialized images that never show up on the web. So if you're a medical doctor who needs to look at diagnostic images of some sort, there's potentially some useful things that a generative image model could help with, is provided you have a model that's trained on diagnostic medical images. So there are some ways to make the generative models a little more responsive to a specific domain, but what you're not getting there is the groundedness in specific facts that we need to have and rely on. Um, and this really gets back to a comment I was making a little earlier about thinking about generative AI purely as a chatbot. Now, I think this is something that maybe we're going to have to reconsider over the next few years, is the expectation that to get value out of generative AI, it's primarily going to be because it can give us an instant answer. I don't think that's going to necessarily be the case. It will be fine for more general questions out there, but when we think about this high information that we have to rely on, it's business critical information, or if it's involves safety or anything like that. Um, I don't think a chat bot is necessarily the best way to implement generative AI, but we can use it to maybe gives us a first draft of something that an expert can review and then develop a uh, a text or some other piece of content that will be a source of truth for something. Once you have an expert review and approval of something, then we can accelerate the development of that kind of content and publish it, and then have that available to people, and they will know that people have looked at it and approved it. And I think that's really one of the bigger opportunities for generative AI. And I'm sort of a little dismayed that I'm not seeing more people kind of focus on that. There's still kind of the idea that, oh, we'll get the instant answer and we just need to keep trying to throw more firepower at this and get more and more, machine cycles trying to grind through the data to come up with the perfect answer first time.
Well, I think part of that problem first is you don't know what you don't know.
Mhm.
So
Yeah,
if the general public doesn't know that there's a way to create sort of a reservoir of knowledge that is relevant and meaningful to them, that can enrich the way that they use a generative AI as a interface, not a chatbot giving
right,
insightful answers, but just as a natural language interface. Like if you're talking to Wikipedia, Wikipedia is not always going to tell you the truth.
right,
It's crowd sourced knowledge. So
right.
you might get some cool, useful tidbits of information that spark interest. But yeah, you don't know what you don't know. And second, is it really in the incentive of companies that are proponents of generative AI to have you use it less? It's in their incentives to have you use it more and experiment so that you can expend your tokens or whatever
Mm,
currency they have. Um,
right, right. Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. I mean, I think we're seeing it, with search engines, for example, now where, they're starting to encourage you to default to the generative AI answer. And, it may not be what people need. And, I mean, to their credit, they're starting to provide some links to some of the original sources from which they draw their summaries, for example, but we're not really sure how much people follow through those links. They kind of think that, oh, well, if the search engine says this is the truth, it must be the truth, and they won't explore those links. So um, we want to be able to accelerate people's access to knowledge. And I think this is what generative AI can do. It can synthesize a lot of things that are out there. It can help uh, expose certain things that we might not be aware of, and get us a pathway to that deeper information that people may be looking for.
um, yeah, I'll play devil's advocate there and say maybe all information on tap isn't the best way to go about it. I think that sometimes having to struggle to seek information and synthesize it on your own breeds for a deeper thought on the subject. I realize just in normal conversations through the dissemination and reliance on
Mm,
Google that, verbalizing it. It's sort of depressing when you can't have a normal conversation and say, "What do you think?"
mm,
What do you reason? You don't have to Google it. We could Google it all day, but
yeah,
what do you think? Like reason with the things that are in your head and give me some sort of answer to give me your unique perspective because I want to hear that. If I want to go try with a robot, there's ChatGPT.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
I think that's true. I mean, what really we have an opportunity to do is to um, kind of unpack assumptions that people have, and so if we use this wrong, the assumptions become opaque. We have no idea of what assumptions we've made, no idea what assumptions the generative AI has made in the answer they've given us back, and it's not working so well. But if we have um, an approach where um, so there's a I was trying out a few weeks ago one of the newer search engines. Is called find.com with a PH. And what I liked about it was they took the question and then kind of broke down sort of different dimensions that would be related to an answer. And then you could really start exploring it and you start learning about things that you maybe weren't thinking about initially. So uh, that's a really useful way of doing this, that the generative AI answer can actually help fan out and let us explore different dimensions. And then by connecting those different tidbits that they're highlighting there and connecting that through metadata to some other sources, then we can really start seeing, a more complete picture of what's there.
So, okay, we talked about generative AI and its shortcomings in terms of accuracy. We've talked about RAG as
Mhm.
a means for overcoming some of those inaccuracies, and then we talked about knowledge graphs as a
Right.
means for crystallizing factual based information into what it is that you're getting from generative AI. So, what are the challenges behind putting this in practice? Because everything's easier said than done, right?
Yeah.
Um, where do we start? And first, how do we start by cutting costs? I think that's a good place to start because that's where any business would start.
Um, no, really good questions, and I think we are starting to see some companies explore the connections between large language models and knowledge graphs. But we're still kind of in early days. So I'm aware of maybe two or three companies that have products out there now that are doing this, and I think there are other people who are working on it, but not enough people are doing this. And because I think everyone is, they're chasing the shiny thing. They think that that vector graph vector databases are the way to solve these problems with the lack of domain knowledge and accuracy. And so that's what they're doing. So we're not nearly seeing enough effort put into knowledge graphs and connecting with LLMs. Now, the good news is that knowledge graphs are a relatively mature technology. So most people who work in technology are familiar with something called the technology hype curve, where it kind of it goes skyrocketing up initially, and then you get to the peak, and then people start encountering all the limitations of the technology there, and then it starts nosediving down until it reaches what's called the valley of despair, and um, and then the people who really have the the confidence that this has some value will work through what it can do. Now, knowledge graphs have been around for a good 15 years, maybe 20 years, depending upon how you look at it. And they've gone through the valley of despair. I mean, they were, and people have worked out some of the issues with them, uh, figuring out how to make them work. So they're a fairly mature technology. Uh, I think these knowledge graphs will start to look very, very attractive as people realize that they can play an important role in making generative AI more useful. I don't know that we have, all the connections in place to just make this really, really easy. Just to give you an example, so what's different about generative AI compared to most technologies is how it developed a very consumer-facing um, role right away. I mean, people started putting generative AI applications right on their smartphones, and so everyone got to play around with it right away. Now they were playing around with a fairly um, unsophisticated version of this compared to what you would need to develop to implement in an enterprise, for example. But everyone got that experience right away with it. Knowledge graphs, not so much. I mean, not people maybe have experienced knowledge graphs indirectly through something like Google search, with their knowledge panels, but most people don't have that direct experience with knowledge graphs. So we need to, I think, with knowledge graphs, sort of improve the user friendliness of them. That's been kind of I think the technology itself is mature, as I said, but the user experience of them isn't. But I think, interestingly enough, generative AI can help with that. I think generative AI, what's so appealing about it is that you can ask questions in natural language. And that's how we behave as people. We want to ask a question. We don't want to write out type some sort of intricate query that has a bunch of, parentheses in it and, all that kind of stuff. We want to just ask a question. So we can marry up the potential of generative AI to translate a natural question and convert it into, a query that a knowledge graph would understand, and then give us back the answer instead of a bunch of strings, or maybe in a table or however that answer is being given back to us. That can be translated back into something that is understandable. So the opportunities are really, really big, but it will take a little investment. I mean, I'm not going to advocate this to say, oh, you're going to save 30% off of your IT costs next year by doing this. We're not there yet, but maybe there are going to be some use cases that are very obvious, that you could trial and find that you get some savings there.
I think you bring up a good point that these technologies are relatively new. Well, I mean, yeah, knowledge graphs have been around since before like the 70s. No, I mean, the, theoretically they've been around since the times of Socrates. But the idea of putting them together, people are trying it. Not as much as you would think, right? Maybe a handful,
Mhm.
couple dozen people around the world are working on that stuff. Um, how do we make this a tantalizing thing to try out? Because we all have to agree that generative AI is not gonna cut it for reproducible, accurate results that have mission critical or at least higher level applications outside of like, hey, can you interpret this in a poetic way, or can you, you
Hmm.
know, give me your interpretation of my essay for my college paper? That's cool, but for real expert systems or augmenting the capabilities of people that we don't have enough talent to fulfill for certain job sectors, certain industries. We need to cross that chasm. Yeah, I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think one of the places where generative AI can really help companies save costs is through um, adapting existing content. So there's a need to take something that you've created and then come up with ways to uh, change how it's presented to different kinds of audiences. And as you mentioned earlier, that's something generative AI is very good at. It basically understands the idea of a template and maybe making some sort of modification of the underlying content that appears within that sort of templated structure. So uh, companies, it's a big kind of burden for companies to come up with, like, dozens of different versions of something for different customer segments or things like that. Um, and provided they've described this well with metadata, um, they can then use generative AI and say, okay, come up with this baseline content we've developed and come up with different versions of it for different markets or different customer segments or whatever. And I think that would be a relatively simple thing to implement that would show a good ROI. So it's kind of finding those things, maybe not trying to shoot for the moon right away, but finding those sorts of examples. I think any company that has a lot of legacy content, things that they've developed over time and they've lost the ability to sort of know what's there, especially when you have things like staff turnover, where people working in the company just don't even know what was created in the past. There's an opportunity to go back and sort of index that and look at it. There's a lot of natural language processing that can sort of figure out what's there, and then you can tag it with metadata, and then use that as the basis for getting answers to queries or developing new content.
On paper, for me, that's a really exciting area of applying generative AI, or some, yeah, I guess, creating a machine that sort of interfaces with knowledge that sits in an organization. Like, what about those multi-generational privately owned companies that have storage archives of hundreds of thousands of written reports and things like that?
Mhm.
If you could feed it in an organized way and create your own digital repository, digital knowledge base, you could talk to your forefathers. How did you make sourdough back in the day? Like, about these time periods, what were the most popular selling products? How was it produced? Where did we source it? Who were our suppliers? I think that's really cool. Like building a interfaceable archive, you
Mm,
know.
right, right,
Um, but I think we're still, as we've been talking so far, working our way on how to build that crystallized knowledge graph, that repository of facts, and marry that with the. I think this sounds right. Kind of paired from generative AI.
right.
Um,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. There's a lot of information that is, just think about it this way. We've gone through this whole big data revolution over the past decade or so, where people realize that, oh, we're sitting on a mountain of data here. I mean, what insights can we derive from that? And so companies hired a lot of data scientists and figured out things they could do to sort of parse that data and identify trends and connect it with other data sets um, and there's been some really valuable things that have come from that. I think we're now getting to the point where we can do the same with content, text-based content in particular, but potentially audio and video content as well, where there's all this potentially useful material in there, and we just don't have the capacity until now to evaluate it. But I think the combination of maybe generative AI making it easier to access and knowledge graphs making it more precise to access and describe, and we can then start querying a lot of this legacy content that has been created and figure out what what's happened in the past that's useful for today. I mean, there's a story I hear people make, and I don't even know if it's true or not, but it makes for a good story. Like it'd be very, very difficult for NASA just to suddenly ramp up and send a man to the moon now, because there's like all that knowledge that went into sending someone to the moon from decades ago that has somewhat disappeared. I mean, when the people involved with that are mostly dead at this point, and where is all that information? Well, to the extent it's out there, it's scattered around. So, but that's just an example of how going back to your archive example, like how can we piece together all these disparate items of information and retrieve what's there and make sense of it as a human being without turning it into a project that you have to hire an army of specialists and they're the only people who would ever be able to make sense of it, because that's not really what we would want to be doing.
Yeah, no, I'd love to converse with Hemingway or, well, any of these poets, writers, whatever. That'd be really cool and educational. I think that would enrich our society in a positive way. Um, but I digress. All these things about what we're looking at doing in this data information space, content space. It's incredibly complex, and I myself am dizzy with all the new developments, all the new papers, all the new insights, all the new experiments
Yeah,
that are coming out week by week, and then new models to boot. You said there's specialized models. Now people are coining the term small language models, medium-sized language models, specialized language models. We're not really looking at this from the parameter formulaic lens of, okay, a language model serves this purpose. Do we want it small or large? It depends. Do we want it domain specific or domain agnostic? It depends.
right.
Uh, it's just we're not having those conversations enough, I don't think. We're just looking at applications and ways of synthesizing very precise pockets of information.
Yeah, yeah, I agree entirely. Yeah, it's a good way to look at it. Yeah, yeah, I mean, I think there's a concept in IT about what when an application's greedy, it's trying to it presumes it's going to do something unless you specifically tell it not to do something. So I think in some ways, maybe we look at large language models in a somewhat greedy way, that it's going to just run everything, when in fact it maybe not the best thing to run everything. But it definitely has a role, an important role. So I want to see it succeed in a way that's useful for people, that enriches our lives and improves efficiency and things like that. And it's just a question of finding the best way to do that.
Um, we do have a minute and a half left on the clock, and I do want to tell the audience, whoever's stuck around, that we will be hosting a series of workshops. Well, first webinars on enterprise taxonomy and ontology, which are key components of developing knowledge graphs. But we will be leading up to host a paid workshop for half a day, sometime in April. If there's anything that you have particular questions about, please send us a message directly or let us know if there's anything that you'd like us to cover. Michael, is there anything that you want to say on the side of taxonomy and ontology?
Um, I think it's really an important foundation for looking at the possibilities here. I think a lot of people um, will be getting more involved with these types of things, but I know that for a lot of people, it feels like it's kind of a technical area, and they don't really know what's involved and things like that. So, what we're looking to do is have a very um, approachable foundation to discuss, what taxonomies are and ontologies and how some of the use cases for them, and then a bit about the process. And so I think it will be a really good series for people who want to get familiar with them. And as Joaquin said, we'll have a full-on workshop following those series of webinars for people who really want to go a bit deeper.
And with that, thank you guys for tuning in. We'll catch you in the next one.
Great. Bye-bye.